This is the ER channel, Empires and Revolution. Today, the 9th of May 2021, is the 76th anniversary of the surrender of Nazi Germany in World War II. After over 5.5 years, tens of millions of deaths, Hitler's military machine was finally put out of commission. The debate rages as to why Hitler lost and why the Allies won. Different people and different groups claim different things about who should get the credit for the Allied victory. From Slavs and Russians, you will often get the narrative that it was all down to the heroic Red Army. They will tell you that 7 out of 10 Germans killed in World War II were killed on the Eastern Front, etc., etc. But the real reason that Hitler lost was because he was in a very difficult situation. A situation that forced him to fight not only 3 major enemies, but also a situation that forced him to arm and prepare for 2 entirely different wars. A 2-front war would have been relatively easy for the Nazis, but what really defeated the Nazis was the fact that they had to fight 2 different kinds of war. Against the Red Army, they had to fight a mass war of tanks and soldiers across vast areas of land. But on the other side, against the British and the Americans, they had an entirely different war to fight, a war that focused much more on air power and sea power. It was Hitler's attempt to ride these 2 very, very different horses that led him to fall off and break his neck. The best illustration of this can be found in The Wages of Destruction, a book by the English historian Adam Tooze, and in particular by a graph on page 348. So when people think of the Third Reich and the German Wehrmacht, they automatically think of panzers, panzer divisions, German tank armies, Guderian, von Manstein, Rommel, these great names associated with tank warfare. But by looking at this graph, you can see that tank warfare was actually a very, very minor part of German military armaments expenditure. The graph shows German armaments production on a month-by-month basis. So, for example, you can see that it was relatively high in July 1940. It then dipped, climbing again in spring 1941, and thereafter levelling off. The period covered is September 1939 to December 1941, so not all of the war years are included. But for Germany, the vital years were 1941 and 1942. By the time 1943 came around, the odds were completely stacked against Germany. The only chance the Germans had to win the war was in 1941 and 1942 by knocking out Russia. To do this, obviously, tank warfare would have been essential. And of course, the Germans did have tanks, large numbers of them, and of varying quality. But by looking at the graph, you can see that tanks were a relatively tiny part of German expenditure. As you can see, each year is divided into 6 sections. From top to bottom, tanks, vehicles, shipbuilding, weapons, aircraft, and ammunition. In July 1940, with France now knocked out of the war, most of the spending is on ammunition and aircraft. In fact, aircraft takes up about 40%. This proportion is maintained more or less in the following months. In July 1940, spending on shipbuilding is relatively tiny, but noticeably it is more than spending on tanks. Over the months leading up to December 1941, tank spending increases slightly from a very small base, whereas shipbuilding increases dramatically. By December 1941, in addition to 40% spending on aircraft, we see about 15% spending on shipbuilding, but still only about 5% spending on tanks. Given the kind of war that Germany was fighting against the Red Army, with its excellent T-34, you would think that a lot more spending on tanks would have been required. However, even in 1941, Hitler had made the calculated gamble that the war in Russia was more or less won, and that it was vital, therefore, to immediately focus on building up Germany's air and sea power. This decision was to some extent revised in the following years, but even in 1943 and 1944, Germany was still trying to re-gear itself for an air and sea war against the Western Allies. This meant that after the Red Army survived the onslaught of 1941, the German Wehrmacht was no longer strong enough to land a decisive punch against the Red Army. And with each passing month and each passing year, it got weaker and weaker. So the essence of German weakness against the Soviet army was due to Hitler racing ahead and preparing for what he envisaged as the next stage of the war, a war in which Germany, controlling Europe and most of Russia, would then have to fend off the immense air and sea power of Britain and America. Hitler wasn't defeated so much by a war on two fronts as a war on two different sets of elements. On the one hand, a war on land, a tank war, and on the other hand, a war against the sea and air powers of the Western Allies. Pulled in these two different directions, the German war machine broke down and collapsed.